We're joined now by gender equity researcher Dr. Lisa Vetten. Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Juliet. Good evening to your viewers.
South Africa has some of the most progressive laws on paper when it comes to GBV and femicide. For example, the Domestic Violence Act, Sexual Offences Act, and the 2022 amendments. Why do you think implementation remains so weak? And what do you see as the biggest barriers to turning legislation into real protection for women and gender non-conforming people?
Well, I think a very simple demonstration of why we have problems with implementation is the Madlanga Commission. That's telling us just how deep the rot in the police has run, that it's being distracted by matters of corruption and by other things. So what it's telling us is, I think, how serious the erosion of the state and its institutions has been, and the consequences of that for women who've experienced violence. We're not seeing the courts cope the way they should. The police are clearly not coping. And if the institutions start to fail, then we lose, I think, quite a major bulwark against violence. And then when you add to that additional problems such as South Africa's very serious economic difficulties at the moment, the fact that many people feel quite discouraged and forgotten and neglected, that there isn't a lot of social cohesion, that you've had so much said but nothing changed. It all adds up to, I think, a very difficult combination of things that can aggravate and drive violence.
Now, there's a common narrative that gender-based violence in South Africa is primarily driven by toxic masculinity and patriarchal culture. To what extent do you think factors like extreme inequality, unemployment, especially among young men, alcohol, drug abuse, and the legacy of apartheid-era violence also fuel this crisis? And how should activists balance addressing culture versus these structural drivers?
Okay, when you're talking about a problem as complex as violence, you can never reduce it to one thing like patriarchy or like toxic masculinity. That's clearly important. And one of the things we have to recognize is that not all men who grow up in South Africa behave violently. So there's obviously got to be other factors that reduce the risk of men behaving violently or aggravate the risk. So things like the economy, as you've mentioned, are a very serious aggravator. To give you another example, that facilitates violence. We've seen policing firearms control, for example, collapse, and what that has meant is an increase in the number of men and women who are being killed with firearms. Take away the firearm, it becomes more difficult to kill women and men. So, those are the kinds of things. You have those factors that make it easier to kill somebody, for instance, and then you have the sort of structural backdrop where you have inequality between men and women. But I think we also have to recognize that some women are far more unequal than others, and that's where you do have to look at our history of racism, how that's also shaped who gets economically excluded and who is doing better in the economy and who isn't, and therefore who's made more vulnerable. So you have to look at where all these factors intersect. There's our history, but I think we also mustn't forget that we don't live permanently in our history. Things have changed quite significantly in South Africa over the last few years. I talked about the erosion of our institutions, but I think we've also got to look at the rise in organized crime. So we've got to have a dynamic view of history to understand how does history and our current circumstances interact in order to produce what we are seeing now. So you have to work at the level of both those structural and historical factors, but also what is happening now and how does it play out at individual level.
Well, we saw some of the visuals there at the march, and many activists criticizing the South African Police Service for mishandling GBV cases, secondary victimization, refusal to open dockets, etc. From your experience, what reforms do you believe would make the biggest immediate difference in police response? And how realistic are those reforms given budgetary constraints and political will?
One of the easiest things I think we should be doing right away is trying to understand the differences between police stations. There is interesting research that shows, for example, how some police officers, at some stations, the police officer does not even know what a domestic violence shelter is, doesn't have a list of them, and doesn't know where to refer somebody to. You go to others, they have all that information, and they will actually take you to the shelter and phone the following day to find out how you are doing. So those kinds of changes are not, they tell us that you don't necessarily need more of a budget. It tells us something about the leadership, the quality of leadership at individual police stations. It tells us something about the attitude of the officers in the station, and it tells us something about the extent to which your leadership has said this is a priority. So I think if we start to look at some of those factors beyond just the financial factors, we would then have an idea of what can we do quickly, because we can see it's working somewhere. How do we take those lessons and make sure that they're happening across the country? What are the changes that we need to make across the country? But I think far too often, people simply can't say, why does this station work better than that station? We're missing a lot of the basic information that I think would enable us to make the kinds of foundational changes that are necessary.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So many topics to discuss on this. And of course, that march taking place across the country today. And hopefully it'll all make a difference. That was gender equity researcher Dr. Lisa Vetten chatting to us.